What happens when a powerful cop's unchecked behavior spirals out of control, leading to an explosive courtroom incident? Watch as Officer Luke Barrett's reign of fear unravels, forcing him to face the justice he thought he could never reach. Comment where you're watching from so everyone can join in and enjoy the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you find this story captivating. Officer Luke Barrett had spent years building a reputation for being a tough, no-nonsense cop. In the Franklin County Police Department, he was known for his stern demeanor and his fearsome presence. He was a man who commanded respect, but most importantly, he commanded fear. Over time, Barrett had become a fixture in the department, feared by his colleagues and the community alike. He didn't make his way through the ranks by following the rules. He made his name by breaking them. Yet somehow he always managed to avoid consequences. Misconduct, excessive force, and racial profiling seemed to follow him, but his superiors turned a blind eye, too afraid or too complicit to hold him accountable. Barrett had earned the kind of power that made him untouchable, or so he thought. That particular morning, Barrett entered courtroom 2B at the Franklin County Courthouse to testify in a routine drug possession case. It was supposed to be just another day in his career, another minor case to check off on his endless list of duties. But fate had other plans. Barrett's presence in the courtroom was more than just a coincidence. It was the catalyst for his fall from grace. The moment Barrett stepped into the room, his eyes scanned the faces of the people present. His attention was drawn to one man standing near the witness box, talking quietly with a defense attorney. The man was sharply dressed, impeccably put together, with an air of calm that seemed out of place in the tense environment of the courtroom. Barrett's eyes narrowed as he stared at the stranger, sizing him up. Without a second thought, Barrett, in his usual brash manner, stormed across the courtroom floor, his boots clacking loudly against the marble. The energy in the room shifted as people turned to watch him approach. His footsteps grew louder, almost deafening in the stillness. The moment Barrett reached the man, without warning, he struck him, his fist landing squarely on the stranger's face. The sound of the punch echoed throughout the courtroom, like a whip cracking through the air. It was an act of aggression so sudden and so jarring that the room seemed to freeze. The gasps from the onlookers were sharp, immediate. Papers rustled as they dropped to the floor, and a pen rolled across the table, coming to a stop at the feet of an astonished court reporter. For several long seconds, time seemed to stand still. No one knew how to react. No one could process what had just happened. The man Barrett had struck didn't flinch. He didn't shout or retaliate. He remained eerily calm, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he reached up to adjust his tie, then wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, brushing away a trickle of blood. Barrett stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, the reality of his actions beginning to sink in. The man, still calm, finally spoke, his voice steady and clear. "I am Judge Antoine Kelly," he said, looking Barrett directly in the eye. "And I am the one presiding over this courtroom today." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The shock in the room deepened. Barrett's breath caught in his throat as he processed the realization. He had just struck the judge, someone who had the power to ruin his career and his life with a single word. For a moment, Barrett couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of stone. His mind was racing, but no coherent thoughts formed. How could this have happened? What had he done? He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But there was no way out. The courtroom was frozen, and all eyes were now on him. His hand, the one that had thrown the punch, trembled slightly at his side. Judge Kelly didn't shout, didn't call for security. He simply turned to the courtroom and announced, "We will take a 10-minute recess." With that, he calmly walked into his chambers, his expression unreadable. The room stayed still. No one knew what to do. Barrett was rooted to the spot, a sinking feeling in his gut. He didn't hear the prosecutor's soft whisper, "You just assaulted a judge." His mind was too numb to process it fully. He had just thrown away everything. The world outside of that courtroom didn't matter anymore. Inside that room, everything had changed. Luke Barrett's rise through the ranks of the Franklin County Police Department had been nothing short of meteoric. Straight out of the police academy in his early 20s, Barrett quickly earned a reputation for being relentless, driven, and, most notably, for getting results. He wasn't just another cop. He was someone who took pride in doing things his way, even if it meant bending or outright breaking the rules. His career flourished in a department that valued efficiency above all else. In an environment where quick action was often celebrated, Barrett was a rising star. He started in the patrol division, where his reputation for taking down criminals quickly and forcefully made him stand out. But it wasn't just his skills that propelled him forward. It was his ability to intimidate and dominate those around him. Barrett was known for his icy demeanor and his unrelenting attitude. If there was one thing the higher-ups in Franklin County respected, it was power, and Luke Barrett exuded it in spades. The more he earned accolades, the more entrenched his position became within the department. But behind the headlines and commendations, there was another side to Barrett's career, a side the public didn't see. It started with small things: unnecessary force during traffic stops, racial profiling that he justified as doing his job, and an almost uncanny ability to get rid of complaints. When a young black man was ticketed for a broken taillight and insisted he had done nothing wrong, Barrett increased the fine for what he called non-compliance when the man argued back. The complaint filed by the man was quietly buried, the case dismissed with no investigation. There were whispers in the department too. Stories about Barrett's temper, his threats, his use of racial slurs when he thought no one important was listening. A Latina mother claimed Barrett had illegally searched her car outside a grocery store. When her young daughter asked why they were being harassed, Barrett supposedly muttered, "You people should know better." The mother filed a report, but within days the complaint disappeared without a trace. The most troubling incident occurred one evening when Barrett was caught on camera shouting profanities at two black teenagers hanging out in front of a convenience store. He accused them of loitering, and when one of the teens began filming, Barrett snapped. The video mysteriously vanished after the boys were arrested for resisting arrest. The footage would never see the light of day, and once again, Barrett's conduct went unpunished. Barrett's internal record was filled with complaints that never seemed to stick. Officers in the locker room had seen him threaten junior officers who didn't back him up, and every time his name came up in an internal investigation, the case was quickly dismissed as not sustained. This was the system Barrett thrived in, one that turned a blind eye to misconduct as long as it didn't make waves. He had friends in high places, including Chief Greg Madsen, who considered Barrett a good cop in a tough world. To Madsen, Barrett's tough, aggressive methods were necessary to deal with the crime-ridden neighborhoods of Franklin County. But even in such a corrupt environment, there were cracks starting to form. Internal Affairs had quietly started to investigate some of Barrett's more egregious behavior. However, he was always one step ahead. He knew how to play the game, how to manipulate the system. He didn't worry about investigations. He was too well connected. His arrogance grew, and so did his belief that no one could touch him. 6 months before the incident in the courtroom, a rookie officer, Jordan McLean, was paired with Barrett for patrol. McLean saw firsthand the troubling pattern of racial profiling. Barrett had stopped 6 black drivers in a single day, all in the same 3-block radius, without any legitimate reason. The rookie filed a formal complaint with Internal Affairs. 2 weeks later, McLean was reassigned to desk duty, while Barrett received a commendation. The message was clear. In Franklin County, power, not justice, ruled the day. Barrett felt untouchable. He was at the top of his game, and no one could challenge him. At a precinct BBQ not long after, he boasted, "They can't touch me. I've got more dirt on half this department than they do on me." What Barrett didn't know was that those cracks were spreading, slowly but surely, and his confidence would soon be his undoing. He didn't see it coming. No one did. But when Barrett struck Judge Antoine Kelly in that courtroom, the timer on his carefully constructed empire finally hit 0. The system, so long corrupted by his influence, was beginning to break down. The very power Barrett had relied on for so long was now working against him. The slap, or in Barrett's case, the punch, had barely landed before the courtroom descended into chaos. The moment the footage hit social media, it became a wildfire. The clip, raw and unfiltered, spread like wildfire. Within minutes, news outlets from across the country picked it up. The world saw a white cop in full uniform attacking a black judge, and the internet erupted. The title on most posts was blunt: Cop punches a judge, doesn't realize it. At first, some commentators thought it was staged, a publicity stunt, maybe even a prank. But the video was too real, too raw. There was no dramatic music, no angles designed to make it look like a scene from a movie. There was only the reality of a courtroom frozen in stunned silence, the shock in Barrett's eyes, and the calm demeanor of Judge Antoine Kelly as he stood there, unshaken. The reactions were immediate and fierce. Activists, lawyers, and even former defendants who recognized Barrett began to flood social media with their own stories. They talked about the aggressive, racist behavior they had experienced at his hands, their grievances that had never been heard until now. People who had once been too scared to speak out were emboldened, knowing that the video had given them the platform they needed. They wanted justice, not just for what had happened in that courtroom, but for everything Barrett had done over the years. But while the public outcry grew, Barrett found himself in the center of a storm he had never anticipated. The internal reaction within the department was less immediate, but it was no less intense. Barrett had been a fixture in the department for so long that the realization of what he had done hit like a bombshell. His reputation, built on intimidation and fear, crumbled overnight. The department had always known there were complaints against him, but no one had ever dared to challenge him directly. Now everything was changing. Even the officers who had once admired him began to keep their distance, avoiding eye contact and whispering behind his back. The first blow came quickly. The chief's assistant left several messages on Barrett's voicemail, urging him to come into the office. Legal counsel for the county sent a quiet inquiry to HR, asking for Barrett's leave to be processed. The whispers in the hallways were impossible to ignore. Officers who had worked with Barrett for years now found reasons to avoid him. Some even called in sick to avoid being involved in the chaos that was sure to follow. It was as if the dam had finally broken, and Barrett could feel the weight of the system turning against him. Back in the courthouse, Barrett's defense team was working behind the scenes to control the narrative. They tried to downplay the incident, claiming Barrett had acted out of fear. According to them, Judge Kelly had looked threatening when he approached Barrett, and the punch was a reflexive response. But the video told a different story. It was clear to anyone watching that Barrett's actions were fueled by anger, arrogance, and an overwhelming sense of entitlement. There was no fear in his eyes, no justification for the violence he had shown. Barrett's public defenders worked feverishly to control the narrative, but they weren't prepared for the backlash. Even conservative media outlets, which typically aligned with law enforcement, began to hesitate. One talk show host cut an interview short, saying, "We'll wait for more facts before jumping to conclusions." It was a subtle but significant shift. The world wasn't buying Barrett's version of events. His reputation as a tough cop was no longer an asset, it was a liability. By noon, Barrett's name had become synonymous with scandal. His career, his reputation, and everything he had built began to unravel at an alarming rate. The story spread far beyond Franklin County, and the footage continued to circulate. It was only a matter of time before internal investigations started to take shape. Back at the department, whispers turned into reports. Internal Affairs began re-examining the old complaints, reviewing Barrett's past actions with a level of scrutiny they had never given before. Suddenly, the system that had protected Barrett for so long was beginning to turn against him. Officers he had once threatened into silence were now speaking up. Some former colleagues who had once been too scared to testify now found the courage to step forward. Detective Naomi Brennan, who had worked alongside Barrett for years, finally spoke out about a time he had threatened her in the locker room. She had stayed silent for years, but now, with the public's eye focused on Barrett, she could no longer stay quiet. Her statement was just the first of many. The floodgates had opened, and once again, Barrett found himself caught in the tidal wave of his own making. In the wake of the incident, Judge Antoine Kelly chose not to engage in the drama. He didn't speak to the media, didn't issue public statements, and certainly didn't take to social media to fuel the fire. Instead, he did what he had always done. He let the law and the system handle the situation. Kelly had been on the bench for over a decade, and his approach to justice was not one of spectacle, but of quiet, unwavering professionalism. He believed that true power didn't need to announce itself. Justice would prevail, not through anger or noise, but through consequences. When Kelly returned to his chambers after Barrett's outburst, He didn't slam the door or throw anything. He didn't call anyone, and he didn't even try to process the incident immediately. Instead, he sat down at his desk, leaned forward, and began to review the docket for the rest of the day, as though nothing had happened. It was a display of calm that stood in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding outside his courtroom. He wasn't shaken, not by the punch, not by Barrett's obvious arrogance, and certainly not by the public scrutiny that was now bearing down on him. His law clerk, Monique Barnes, stood frozen by the door, holding the folder she had meant to deliver. She hesitated for a moment before stepping into his office. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft, unsure of what to expect. Kelly glanced up at her, his expression calm and composed. "I'm fine," he said, his tone steady. "Sit down." Monique sat, her eyes scanning his face, looking for any sign of anger or frustration, but she saw none. Instead, Kelly looked at her with quiet intensity, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. "I don't know what she thought she was doing," Monique said, referring to Barrett. "We can press charges. The footage is everywhere already." Kelly nodded slowly. "We could, but I want to see how they handle it." Monique raised an eyebrow. "You mean the department?" Kelly looked at her, his gaze steady. "I mean the whole system. Let's see if it's still allergic to accountability." Monique blinked in understanding. She knew Kelly's style. He wasn't going to push the issue. Instead, he was going to sit back and let the system show its true colors. Kelly didn't need to scream for attention. His silence was as loud as any protest could have been. By lunchtime, Kelly's name had already begun to trend. He had given a graduation speech at a local high school 2 years prior, and clips of it began to resurface. One quote in particular gained traction. "The law isn't a weapon, it's a tool, and it belongs to everyone, not just the loudest voices." People began to repost the video, and his calm demeanor and reasoned approach started to become a symbol of what true justice looked like. But Kelly didn't engage with the media. He didn't call for a press conference or offer sound bites for the news outlets. When reporters reached out to him for comment, he simply gave one line: "I expect the same level of professionalism and accountability I've shown others for the past 12 years. I trust the system to handle this properly." It was an answer that did not scream for attention, but the weight behind it was undeniable. In that single sentence, Kelly made it clear. This wasn't about him. It was about ensuring that Barrett would be held accountable. Inside the department, things were becoming increasingly uncomfortable for Barrett. He was still technically on active duty, though on administrative leave, but the pressure was mounting. The chief's assistant left messages for him that went unanswered, and legal counsel for the county made quiet inquiries into how to proceed with the investigation. Officers who had once been Barrett's allies were now keeping their distance. The investigation into his conduct was moving forward, but it was clear that the once untouchable officer was no longer a figure of influence. The more Barrett tried to downplay the situation, the more the pressure grew. His lawyer advised him to keep a low profile, but it was clear that the tide was turning against him. He was losing control, fast. And as the story made its way into the headlines, the cracks in his armor became impossible to ignore. The public was beginning to demand justice, and the system was starting to respond in ways it had never done before. Meanwhile, Judge Kelly remained resolute. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to make speeches or call attention to himself. He simply let the facts speak for themselves. And while Barrett's world began to implode, Kelly continued to preside over his cases with the same quiet dignity he always had. But what was happening in Franklin County was bigger than one incident. It was a turning point, a moment when people started to realize that the system could no longer protect those who abused their power. The moment Barrett punched Judge Kelly, the world had seen something that couldn't be unseen. It was a shift in the very fabric of the system, a realization that power could be checked, that accountability wasn't just a concept, but something that needed to be enforced. Barrett might have thought that his career was invincible, that he could continue to operate above the law, but Judge Kelly's silent resolve had already set the stage for a much larger reckoning. After the public hearing, the true consequences of Luke Barrett's actions began to unfold. What Barrett had once believed to be a momentary lapse in judgment, his violent outburst in the courtroom, was now the spark that ignited his complete unraveling. His world, built on intimidation and power, had come crashing down around him. The once untouchable officer now found himself completely exposed. 2 days after the hearing, Barrett was officially placed on permanent leave. The department's official statement was short and devoid of any sympathetic language. Officer Barrett's conduct in the courtroom was unacceptable. He will be removed from duty immediately, with all benefits revoked, pending further investigation. For Barrett, this was the moment the system he had abused for years finally turned against him. But the consequences didn't stop with his dismissal. His reputation, carefully crafted over years of ruthless behavior, now lay in tatters. The internal investigations into his past misdeeds ramped up, and soon former colleagues who had stayed silent for years started to speak out. Detective Naomi Brennan, who had been threatened by Barrett in the past, gave a statement to Internal Affairs. Other officers and former suspects stepped forward, detailing instances of abuse and misconduct. Barrett tried desperately to maintain control of the narrative. His lawyer suggested he reach out to the media, hoping to shift public opinion. Barrett tried to claim he acted out of fear during the courtroom incident, but the damage was already done. The video of his assault on Judge Kelly had gone viral, and the public had already decided. Barrett was a symbol of everything wrong with the system. He could no longer hide behind his badge or the departmental protection he had once enjoyed. A few weeks later, the Franklin County Police Department held a press conference. The chief, flanked by legal counsel, issued a statement that was the final blow to Barrett's career. "We do not condone Officer Barrett's actions in the courtroom. An internal investigation is ongoing, and the department takes this matter very seriously." There was no mention of Barrett's past heroics or his lengthy service record. The department had moved on, and so had the public. Then came the final, most humiliating moment of Barrett's downfall. He was summoned to a public hearing before the Civilian Review Board, a group of local leaders and community members tasked with reviewing his actions. The hearing was intense, and the board made it clear that Barrett's violent outburst was not an isolated incident. It was a culmination of years of unchecked misconduct. One by one, witnesses took the stand to testify about Barrett's abusive tactics and racial profiling. Detective Brennan spoke of the threats she had faced from Barrett, and former suspects described how Barrett had manipulated the system to suit his own agenda. Finally, Judge Antoine Kelly, who had remained silent throughout the entire process, was called to the stand. His testimony was simple and direct. "I'm not here to destroy a man's life. I'm here to remind this community what justice should look like and what it should never look like again." His words carried weight, and it was clear to everyone in the room that accountability was non-negotiable. The board issued its decision. Officer Luke Barrett was to be permanently removed from duty. All of his benefits were revoked, and his conduct was referred to the state attorney for further investigation. Barrett's career was officially over, but the real lesson was for the community and the department. The entire episode forced a reckoning, one that the people of Franklin County had long needed. Barrett's downfall was a moment of clarity, a reminder that the abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. Judge Kelly's quiet, steadfast response to the violence in his courtroom showed the community that true power came from restraint, not aggression. It was a clear lesson that justice didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. As Barrett faded from the public eye, he was left to deal with the wreckage of his own making. He moved to a neighboring county and found work in private security, far from the power he once wielded. His name appeared in the local news only as a footnote, a reminder of a man who had once been at the top but lost everything. The community of Franklin County slowly began to heal, but it had been irrevocably changed. More people stepped forward to call out misconduct in the department. Officers underwent updated bias training, and the Civilian Review Board gained real influence in reviewing cases of police misconduct. The change was gradual, but it was real. Barrett's fall was a painful but necessary reminder of the importance of accountability, both for individuals in positions of power and for the systems that allow them to thrive unchecked. The fall of Officer Luke Barrett is a stark reminder that power, when left unchecked, can lead to corruption and abuse. Barrett's reign of intimidation and fear was only possible because the systems around him ignored the signs of misconduct for too long. The lesson here is that true justice comes from accountability, not just in the courtroom, but in every institution, every system, and every individual. Judge Antoine Kelly, by choosing not to engage in revenge but to let the system work, showed the importance of restraint and professionalism in the face of injustice. His calm response to Barrett's violent outburst proved that silence can be a powerful tool when it leads to real change. Ultimately, the story demonstrates that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law, and that the system must always strive for accountability, fairness, and justice.